Preparing
The Gilded Age.
The Gilded Age was a term coined by Mark Twain. His intention of calling the Gilded Age was to show the extreme society at the time. Throughout this period, although there was the emergence of the middle class, the rich were very rich and the poor were very poor. With the captains of industry, or the robber barons, at the forefront, the economy would have seemed to be flourishing. There were glamorous parties and abundances of wealth, and they were at the lifestyles of all during the Gilded Age. However, if one were to look closer, they would see that the lifestyles of luxury weren't the case for most of the population. Underneath all the gilded glamour of the age was poverty and oppression. With powerful men controlling each industry, such as Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Morgan, many were left jobless. Their smaller businesses were crushed by the large corporations, and it was evident that the rich man ran society. Those who were wealthy controlled politics and the social scenes. Those who were poor were often used, cheated, and barred from what was deemed to be for high society only. So while society at this time may have appeared golden and luxurious from the outside, a deeper look would reveal the economic, political, and social struggles that were also part of the Gilded Age. With this new age in America, we see these brilliant people channeling their ideas and their resources into the improvement of life for other Americans. We have new inventions such as phones. I got 2 phones.
I got 2 phones, one for the plug and one for the load.
The light bulb, we have gasoline engines, and we have planes. We have these people like Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, the Wright brothers, George Westinghouse, these brilliant, brilliant people making life better for others.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, you caught me at a bad time, but I can still tell you about the Gilded Age. So as you can see, the Gilded Age was a time of a few men with a ton of monopolistic power. This caused the ability of recessions to occur from individual people. An example was the Panic of 1873, and this was caused when Jane Cook, who was a man who financed railroads, he went bankrupt, and this resulted in people selling their belongings, closure of the stock market for 10 days, and banks collapsing, and this therefore led to the overall economy failing.
The Nation magazine described Wall Street. Great crowds of men rushed to and fro, trying to get rid of their property, almost begging people to take it from them at any price.
Besides the setback, a lot of monopolies had so much power and were very successful for the people who ran them. An example is Cornelius Vanderbilt. He bought the railroads and helped them become safer with lower prices. There was also Daniel Drew, Jay Gould, and Jim Fisk, and they were considered corporate pirates because they extracted wealth from these monopolies. So monopoly guys did not like them. And then there was John D. Rockefeller. He monopolized rock oil. Andrew Carnegie, he monopolized steel, and J.P. Morgan monopolized the banks. These monopolies formed through horizontal integration, which is when they take over all the businesses that have to do with the same thing, such as oil production, or vertical integration, which is when they control all the means of production. And the Gilded Age was a time when all these monopolies took power.
There is one specific moment that comes to mind when thinking about the type of businessman that Cornelius Vanderbilt was. There's an instance in which Vanderbilt learns of a man's plot to cheat him, and Vanderbilt shows just how cunning and cruel he can be when it comes to business.
The prices of steamboats have been rising. I just think we need to focus on the Transcontinental Railroad.
I like steamboats.
You have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law takes too long, but I'll ruin you.
So this really brings us to the question of captain of industry or robber baron. These are 2 very different phrases with 2 very different meanings meant to characterize the same people. For men at the top of the food chain, the word captain of industry was more likely used. The wealthy and those who benefited from the monopolies would have seen the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies as leaders. However, those who were cheated, those who were poor, and those who were at the bottom of the food chain would have described these men as robber barons. In this instance in which Vanderbilt confronts the man planning to hurt his business, he is showing the real power that he and all the other monopolizers of industry have. He has the power to control all aspects of his industry, prices, companies, goods, and people. And we as historians have to recognize how much power in the hands of a single man is really good for the economy. This time was the first time we had the emergence of a middle class in America. These people were not as rich as the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, but they were not as poor as the rural Americans working on the railroads and refineries. The middle class started to move away from big cities and into the suburbs, but the cities were still important in the daily lives of the people, especially for work and going into the city for fun. To make these cities more livable and enjoyable for the middle class, we have the start of the beautiful city movement, which is when architects began creating a distinct American style. Especially important was livability emphasis because clean water was now available and cholera was less of a problem. And cholera was a big problem, dysentery and cholera and stuff. She's right. Isn't that lovely? That's not a problem anymore with clean water.
It's radical.
Now, in this era, we saw political parties splintering. We have groups like the Populists who were against poverty and corruption. And half of the Republicans were also against this, but the other half were very content with the economy that the Rockefellers and the Carnegies had built. And the poor people, they didn't matter to them. Again, that goes along with the Gilded Age of we have this nice outward appearance, but people are very poor and we don't care about social reform. And religion in this time, it grew a lot actually. People are now able to dedicate their time to religion. Protestantism tripled in membership, and people were now going to be missionaries. They went out to other countries and they evangelized, but they also were there for other selfish interests like money.
The South of the United States was doing very poor economically. Their big industries were cotton and tobacco, which weren't doing very well. However, the North and West of the United States were thriving. Americans' wages grew significantly because of the Industrial Revolution, which caused millions of Europeans to come to the United States. These included immigrants from Italy, Greece, Poland, China, Japan, Korea, and even Russia. Jewish citizens in Russia migrated to the U.S. because of government-directed attacks on them, and these were known as pogroms. Another reason that the immigrants came to the United States was because of the expansion of education. Ellis Island in Upper New York Bay was the gateway for over 12 million immigrants to the United States. It was the busiest immigrant inspection station for over 60 years. And the term melting pot was used during this time period because immigrants who came to the United States would melt into the culture of the Americans. Because there were so many immigrants, the U.S. passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which suspended Chinese immigration, limited the civil rights of the Chinese immigrants, and forbade their naturalization. Most immigrants and poor families worked in sweatshops, which were small, poorly ventilated shops or apartments crammed with workers. Art became very important during this decade. There were two types of styles, called Impressionism and Realism. Impressionism used scenes from everyday life to show the beauty of nature and its surroundings. Realism portrays the real life and problems and struggles of ordinary people. Winslow Homer was recognized for his paintings using watercolors and oils. He painted bloody scenes in the Civil War. This falls in the category of realism. Eakins was most known for being the most profound realist in the 19th century, and Harnett was said to be the era's best still life painter.
The 1870s was a decade of music in America. Past music has been focused on the Civil War, with themes including slavery, death, love, and women's suffrage. However, now there was a shift to popular folk and gospel songs. Most music was still played on the piano and organ, and lyrical topics also began to feature the physical changes of the United States, especially the railroad.
Fashion was very important during the Gilded Age. Dressing properly defined one's status regarding social class and wealth. While male and female attire differed, there was a clear distinction between morning and evening wear for both. Men wore frocks, dress pants, hats, and suits. Their evening attire was typically a dark suit, with the morning attire having a more casual approach. For females, fashion was incredibly strict, and basic rules had to be understood before one could even understand how to dress properly. There were different dresses for every type of occasion, event, and leisure activities, along with different dress code discretions made by hosts for evening events.
In the 1870s, about 80% of the U.S. population was the working class. Families were larger than today due to high infant mortality rate. Their father was the head provider for the family, and while some women worked as seamstresses, most were full-time caregivers. Divorce was legal during this decade, but very uncommon, since it was only legal for 13 years previous. Also, despite the call for increased education, children were expected to contribute to the family by working, often starting between ages 10 and 12.
Societal trends in the Gilded Age were unlike that of the period before and during the Civil War. Expansion of industry and economic growth led to a large increase of personal wealth, immigration, and philanthropy. There was also an increase in the common people's participation in politics, but corruption in politics grew as a result of that. The Gilded Age also saw reform movements such as the early stages of prohibition, women's suffrage, and the improvement of working conditions. One key characteristic of the Gilded Age was the widening of the gap between the social classes. There were three distinct classes: the upper class, the middle class, and the dirt poor. The rich were richer than ever. The middle class is a lot like how it is in modern times, but the poor were extremely poor. Many try to justify this extreme divide by saying that the overall economy of the United States was improving and the poor were largely ignored.
In the 1870s, when America was just recovering from the Civil War, a new movement in American literature, known as realism, began. Before the Civil War, idealism and romanticism were popular. However, after experiencing such a horrible war with countless losses, authors began writing to show people a real life rather than an ideal life. They wanted people in the United States to understand what was actually happening in their country. Willa Cather was one of the most famous American writers in the 1870s. She was a well-known realist because of the book she wrote about what life was like during those times and how hard it was to survive. O Pioneers is one of Cather's greatest realist novels that talks about real life back in the 19th century. In this novel, Cather writes from her point of view, making the story even more real for the reader that she is telling her personal experiences to. Another important book that was written during this era was Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. This book, published in 1876, conveyed realism through its use of diction. Twain wrote the novel using words of the common people. He also wrote about topics and issues that were a part of everyday life, like boyhood and abuse.
You can just cut that and I'll sing it.